Good afternoon and welcome to the Vera Institute of Justice and Milpa Collective's 2021 Restoring Promise event, aptly named this year Championing Dignity. I'm Candice Jones, President and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation, and I am thrilled to be in discussion with colleagues domestically and abroad on the timely topic of human dignity. As humans, we are constantly in an existential battle for our own dignity and agency. We can often see when our dignity is being abridged. You see that struggle in the fights for essential work and Black lives alike. Today's conversation, however, will center on the systemic ways we diminish dignity in this nation through our correctional system, and how we likely pay a very high societal cost for that choice. I'm joined today by Jan Strømnes, Deputy Governor of Halden Prison in Norway, a facility he joined just before its opening in 2009 that has long been heralded the most humane maximum security facility in the world. We also have Premal Dharia, a former public defender and founding executive director of the Defender Impact Initiative. She now is the executive director of the Institute to End Mass Incarceration at Harvard Law School. Welcome, Jan and Premal. How are you both doing this afternoon?
Fine,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
So, I want to start by putting the question to both of you. Just talk to us a little bit about how you believe your work is addressing the inhumane treatment of people in prisons. I'll start with you, Jan.
Well, for the last 12 years, I've been the deputy governor at Halden Prison, as you said. We During those years, we've had an inmate population that's quite mixed when it comes to nationalities, colors, beliefs, and what we have seen through those years is that there are some universal effects when it comes to kind of a humane practice in corrections. Um, we have, because of that, drawn some international attention to our work, and I've been lucky enough to see or to be engaged in other countries that are. I wouldn't say that we have a flawless kind of system, but I've seen systems that are at least less flawless than our own, and I've been lucky enough to have a path where that I've found personally very rewarding. Um, so I guess that's some of my background and how we or kind of my facility approaches in very general terms the issues of inhumane treatment. I'll hopefully come back to it in more detail later on. But if I can just address another question very briefly, and why is this kind of issue about the inhumane treatment of people? Why is this a timely question to ask nowadays? If you allow me to kind of spend a couple of words on the big picture, we see all around the world that human rights are kind of under fire. We see that
Yeah.
we can start in Afghanistan. You can see women's rights. You can see the Sharia legislation being put into force. If that's too far away, you can go to Europe. You can look at countries like Poland and Hungary, where they are getting new legislations regarding sexual orientation. And if Europe is too far away, you can go to the United States, where abortion now is a tense issue again. So I feel that individual rights is under pressure all around the world. So that's why I think addressing the inhuman treatment of people in prisons is a very timely issue to raise nowadays. Because
That's
yeah.
That's perfect, Jan. Uh, Premal, Jan just talked about how, his work dealing with conditions of confinement there in Norway is both about impacting human dignity in that country, but frankly, they're also doing some modeling in his work, speaking and traveling all over the world. He put that in a timely context. Talk to me about your work domestically. You have done a great deal of work as an advocate, really focused on keeping people out of prison. How do you think about that as sort of protecting human dignity, even for those folks that are incarcerated?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think that it's so important to draw the threads of commonality between what's happening domestically and abroad, and then it's also important to highlight there are obviously features of the United States and its history that are unique and important to name. So, in my work, as you mentioned earlier, Candice, I was a public defender for many years, and so I stood beside people who were charged in the system and spent my days trying to help them navigate the criminal legal system and trying to find their way out of it. And that included, of course, having hundreds and hundreds of clients who were incarcerated, and then many clients who went on to continue being incarcerated in prisons beyond their incarceration at the jail. And so that the bulk of my career has been spent standing next to those people. And now I work on broad issues of mass incarceration more generally. Our work at the Institute is focused on ending mass incarceration root and branch. And what that means for us is thinking about creative approaches that tackle the underlying foundations. There are, of course, socio-political foundations that run deep in our country, like white supremacy and entrenched poverty. And there are also systemic foundations, parts of the criminal legal system's machine that kind of foster and reinforce that harm. And, as lawyers, we're seeking to engage in the areas where we can best put to use the tools and skills that we bring. And part of that is thinking creatively about the role that lawyers can play in tackling it. And so, more broadly, as Jan was talking about why this is timely and why we should be thinking hard about sort of like these issues writ large right now. I think in the United States in particular, there has been, of course, a broad reckoning over the last few years, in particular around police violence, mass incarceration, racial injustice, and more people are engaged in those conversations and seeking to do work around these issues, and that's wonderful. And when it comes to tackling mass incarceration in our country, a lot of the focus has been on what happens prior to entry into jails and prisons, and then what happens after. And I think there's no way to really take on this bigger issue that many people are now engaged in without reckoning with the fact that there are nearly 2 million people currently incarcerated inside of jails and prisons, and their daily lives matter in this larger conversation as well.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you opened the door, because Jan's day to day is about understanding what the daily lived experience is of people who are in custody. Jan, can you talk a little bit to us? Because as I understand it, there was a period when Norway sort of did a rethinking on how it was, how that lived day to day experience would take shape and what that would mean for the country. Talk about the challenges when the country was overgoing that culture change, and what were really the goals that you were driving that change?
Hmm. Well, I guess our situation about 2 decades ago were very much the same as what's the case in the United States nowadays, except from mass incarceration. But the issues of inhumane treatment in prison, we had the same issues well back in the late 80s, early 90s. And just to give you some facts about the situation back then, I said that it's quite similar to the United States, but of course on a much smaller scale, of course. But we had a problem with riots. We had the problems with escapes. We had a lot of issues with substance abuse in prison. We had a lot of inmates with severe psychiatric problems, which we will really have also today. We had two very tragic murders on correctional officers, and there were very limited kind of dialogue and relations between staff and inmates. So that was the situation back in the late 80s, early 90s, and so the government found out that we really need to have an overhaul of our whole system. So in a way, one could go in two different directions. We could go in more strict directions to try to rectify, the errors or the safety flaws. Instead, we decided that we have to make our prisons more humane, really. So we have been 20 years ago just where the United States are today, and now we have 20 years of experience of what is the results of going in a more kind of humane manner. So and we did that by setting new goals, having new policies, training our staff a little bit differently. There was resistance, of course, but in the end, everybody, frontline officers, management, everybody saw that there was so much to gain by having a different approach to the incarcerated people.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically about what you feel like has been gained by the changes that you guys have made?
Well, it has impacted on so many levels, really. We normally, or it's of course naturally to start with the inmates. I mean,
Yeah.
if the inmates feel that they are being treated more respectfully and more humanely, I mean, they can focus their energy, and our experience shows that they can focus their energy more on uh, kind of being motivated to change and have a better future. If they are treated, inhumanely in an unsafe environment, their energy is more used, to protect themselves uh, physically or mentally. They will issues like aggression will arise much more. So you have to kind of turn around how they use their energy by creating a safe environment and by kind of restoring the dialogue and respectful dialogue. Um, so what we did, we did train people in kind of communication skills, de-escalating communication, and we changed the whole role as a correctional officer from being the old guard role to being more like kind of a mixed officer and social worker, being much more being much more role model towards the inmates. So this had some very important gains for the inmates, but also for the staff, because I think your motivation for change could be the perspective of the inmates, but it could also be the inmates of the staff, because staff and inmates are so kind of related to each other, so that if this working environment is more safe, um, it will be a better kind of workplace environment. And looking at the issues in life for correctional officers in the US, for instance, like their life expectancy, the level of PTSD, post traumatic stress syndrome, yes, and well, divorces, domestic violence. I mean, if you have a working environment that is harsh and you feel unsafe, it reflects back on your personal life. So there are gains also for the staff working in a more humane tradition in prison, actually. And
Premal, what Jan's talking about, he's drawing this connection between the change story that happened in Norway. What were some of the outcomes that they had, and what are some of the outcomes that they're having now, they're seeing now, and the impact? One of the questions I want to put to you is, what do you think are the costs? Who's being harmed by the choices that we're making domestically on the way our correctional system is constructed now?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I'm learning as I'm listening as well. And I come much more from the perspective of someone who's been on the side of people who are being incarcerated, right? And their communities, as an advocate directly on behalf of those people. And now as someone who has sort of zoomed out to thinking about bigger picture structural change, but very much from the perspective of the people who, of someone who stands beside the people who might be impacted.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I think that when we are talking about incarceration generally, right, we are talking about trauma. There's no way to avoid that sort of centerpiece of what happens, right? The very idea is to separate people from their communities. Like that's the idea. And and when we do that, of course, like the answer to your question, in my view, is whole communities are impacted, right? It's There are, of course, the people who go inside physically into the buildings who are incarcerated and removed. They have children, they have parents, they have friends, they have other family, they have jobs and apartments and all of these things, and communities suffer. And so there's like the deep trauma that's inflicted on people who are on the inside because of the variety of, I mean, name the harmful condition or issue. We can talk about a number of those. But there's that fundamental piece of removal that I think we need to be real about, and real in terms of trauma. And as we're thinking about policy interventions and um, you know the reality that most people who are in prison are coming home, and what we want to do about trying to create conditions so that communities can actually thrive, including the people who are going in and coming out. Like, you know, we need to be thinking about that piece as an important piece of how we think about change.
I love that. Do you know what's so interesting about that? I feel like, and you guys can correct me if you think differently about this. I think when we start to talk about crime, it becomes one of the a few conversations where it's all about the individual harm, the individual outcome. But Premal, I hear you drawing the broader societal impact of all the choices that we're making, which I think is so powerful. Because for both of you, I guess the question I want to ask is, why is prison reform meaningful? You talked both at the top about why it's timely, but why is it important? And I imagine that question has to be more about why it's important for society at large, not just for that individual that we too often focus on when we're talking about it. Premal, I'm going to stay with you for a second and just get your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I can speak some from the personal experience of having watched people I represented experience some of the harms of jails and prisons and certain conditions, and talk about some of why I think this is a moment in time in which we could and should be paying more attention to this. But I think when we think about prisons, as I mentioned earlier, trauma is just central. And so if we're thinking about that, what are the ways that we can address that? Like, what are the ways in which trauma manifests, right? And as I mentioned, I think that family removal is a really big piece of this. And so, I think prison reform issues are really important to talk about because there are ways in which we can address that. We can increase access to families, right? We can increase connections between children and their parents. We can find ways to make sure that people are getting their basic human needs met, including connection to people who love them and who they love. And so that's one piece of why I think this is really important. There are other sort of basic human needs that I think that we should be talking about as well. We often talk about the term prison conditions can mean so many things, right? It can include a wide spectrum of conditions that get imposed upon people. I think that many people outside of the space that we operate in, right, outside of the space of potentially even our audience here operates in, don't know that there are often basic human needs that aren't being met, right? Food that's edible, right? Medical care that's actually attentive, dental care, right? And I think also often of women and access to reproductive health care.
Yeah.
Like, these are the kinds of things that I think, it's important to name this as an issue. And it's important right now in this moment when people are talking in such a widespread manner about the harms of mass incarceration, to be addressing the fact that there are basic human needs that are not being met.
Yeah. I love, what's so interesting is that one of the things about prison in the US is that you get involved in the criminal justice system here and you lose the ability to be considered or talked about as a human. Shout out to my partners at Forward US for their People First campaign. This idea of just calling people, not referring to them in these terms that define something that they did and not who they are, is such a powerful topic that it just talks about all the fundamental ways that we strip of humanity, which reminds me of what you say about access to quality food, family. Jan, when I first met you, I actually had the pleasure of visiting you in Norway. You were doing a briefing for a group of stakeholders there. You threw up a picture on a PowerPoint presentation. It was of men who are incarcerated in the US, wearing jumpsuits, chained together. You threw up that image, you looked at it, and you looked at us and you said, and you guys wonder why you have such a high recidivism rate. Like, period. And you just sort of let that hang in the room. I thought it was such a powerful framing of the intersection of that imagery of what we do and the outcomes that it met. Can you talk about that question that I just put to Premal about why prison reform is meaningful and meaningful for the broader society?
Well, meaningful for the broader society. Then I will start talking about the communities like Premal did, because they also are impacted. Premal mentioned, families, children, so on and so forth, and of course of key interest, absolutely. But there are also other parts of communities that are being, involved. Basically, prisons are very closed environments. So I would assume that the general public don't feel that what happens inside the prison has anything to do with them at all, but it does. Uh, Through families, through children, and through the fact that at least 95% of the inmates are getting out someday. So as we used to say, what kind of neighbor do you want really? So communities are in the long term impacted by what happens inside a prison. So that's the short answer to why prison reform is important. You can focus on economy by spending a few dollars more on trying to help an incarcerated, with his whatever it might be, education, skills, substance abuse treatment, whatever. Look at the long-term picture. What can he or she contribute to society if you really are able to rehabilitate someone? So, I mean, if you, what do you expect to get out of a prison if you don't try to rehabilitate them from day one, really? Um, uh, and so what we try to do, and what you've seen, at least a PowerPoint or two about, is how we, for instance, try to build normality into the
Yeah.
Norwegian system. And I'm not going to address normality in the perspective of architecture, but just how, um, like, why can't inmates use their own clothes? A small thing, really. But I've talked to, I think it was inmates up in North Dakota who has just been able to use their private clothes. And suddenly they were able to express themselves, of course, within certain limits. But what that meant for their self-esteem, there were so much small things you can do that increase their experience of kind of respect and their self-esteem. And it could be small things, and it could be more bigger things like visitation facilities that Premal talked about. There are so many issues that you can, with very low cost, actually increase the kind of the humane operation of a prison, which gives long-term effects not only for the incarcerated but also for the community, really.
Talk more about that concretely. What do you think are some of those things? You talked about allowing people to dress in their own clothes, having family visitation. You and Primal both have touched on that. That
Mm.
connectivity, which we all know both has an impact on what's happening in facility, but frankly, better facilitates what's going to happen when people are returning home.
Mm.
Will you talk more, Jan, specifically about some of the innovations that you think we need to be looking at in
Mm.
conditions of confinement, in housing, in education and technology? What are things that you think that we need to be looking at in this country to improve what's happening, to restore dignity?
That's a very big question. So,
Yeah.
in which end should you start? I think you have to start with the environment inside prison. You
Yeah.
have to start with how people interact with each other, because I mean, you can't expect an inmate or an incarcerated person to be motivated to do things better in life if he feels that the conditions around him are harsh and negative and inhumane. So you have to start, I think, with the prison culture and the prison environment.
Yeah.
And I think you should, in a way, start with staff. I mean, staff are, you know, kind of the most powerful resource in a prison. So, I mean, the responsibility for making change has to be with management and staff. So, and I think you really need to start with the prison culture and the environment. And if you can create a better environment, you can do so much with the at a low cost to use that word. How about using first names?
Yeah.
How about give an inmate a normal handshake when he comes to the facility?
Yes.
How about saying hi? How about asking and really meaning, how are you today? And if he says, I'm not that good today, how about spending 2 minutes and talk to this person? How about investing a little bit of yourself as you would to your neighbor or your present neighbor, because this could be your future neighbor. So you can do so much by just, addressing staff behavior inside prison. It's not rocket science, as I used to say.
Yeah. Premo, what about that? What do you think we need to be doing inside facilities to improve conditions, to make it more humane?
Yeah, I was reflecting on what Jan was saying and thinking like there's the United States is not only leads the world, obviously, in incarcerating human beings, but I think also leads the world in torturing the people that it incarcerates. And so like there's this sort of there's a need to understand where we are, right? Which is I think there's a lot that we need to be doing differently. There's a lot that we need to be doing differently. And so in terms of meeting basic human needs, basic sort of human, the things that we acknowledge for those of us who are not incarcerated, right? The things that we acknowledge for ourselves that we need as human beings, I think is sort of starting there and saying we need, like everybody needs these things. Everybody needs food and medical care. Everybody needs access to sunlight. Everybody needs access to the people they love. Right? These are the sort of fundamental things that I think we can start with as a baseline. Like, let's figure out the ways to make sure that people are having their baseline needs met. I think the COVID pandemic really highlighted for many of us, right? Like what the impact of conditions can be. And in a pandemic in particular, obviously we saw both the stark reality that conditions could exacerbate harm, but also the fact that rapid change was actually possible in response to those conditions. Like, we started decarcerating more. We started figuring out like how to, and I'm not saying that everybody did this very well, but we tried, I think, as communities tried to figure out ways to get people access to the things they needed. And we don't need a pandemic to hopefully continue to figure out ways to get human basic needs met. And so I would start there. I think that mental health care is really important. I think that physical health care is really important. I think an underestimated issue that I have heard so many of people I have represented talk about is dental care. Like there's a real lack of dental care, and it matters for a million reasons, right? The reality for all of these things is that a lack of physical care leads to deterioration well beyond the physical, and a lack of mental health care leads to deterioration well beyond mental health, right? And that's also true for dental care. And so these things are all interconnected. So figuring out ways to sort of meet these basic needs, I think, is really critical. And then in terms of, other sort of another category, which I'm happy to expand upon more as we get into further conversation about this, but I think a real category from my personal experience, again, as a lawyer who represented people who are incarcerated, is access to information, right? Access to people and access to opportunities and information is just really, really important as an area for real change.
I love that you went there, Premal. One of the things that happens is that you guys have both answered it this way because of the way I put the question to you. What can corrections departments do? What can we be doing in the facilities to change and make things more humane? But a lot of that puts the responsibility singularly on those institutions when we know that they are a result of a sort of larger set of choices. And so I wonder for you both, what do you think kind of policy changes that we need to see, broader legislative policy changes, to actually make conditions more humane, make those systems work in a way that is indeed corrective? Premal, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a really good point, right? There's no singular responsibility for some of the problems I laid out. I mean, these are interconnected problems. They span systems, they span institutions and actors. And we need to be addressing them holistically. I mentioned access to information as an area that I think is ripe for real change. And I'm thinking specifically about a couple of different things. One is access to lawyers and to legal materials and law libraries. Right. I think that I'm not sure that it's obvious to many people who don't operate in this sphere, but once people if people are charged in the criminal legal system and they're incarcerated in a jail, say, and then they are convicted and sentenced, and once they're done with their appeal and they're serving, they move to a prison and they're serving their sentence in a prison, there's no more access to counsel, right? There isn't a lawyer who's just, they can pick up and call. There's no lawyer that's theirs anymore necessarily. And so there's just a real dearth of sort of structural supports in place for people to have lawyers and then to access them. And so I think that's not a problem that prison officials can solve, right? Like that's a sort of one that needs legislative intervention beyond that, and then needs the cooperation and support of people who are running facilities to give people access. And so like that's one example. Another one that I've been thinking a lot about is educational access. I helped to run an online publication, a new online publication called Inquest, that's been tagged a decarceral brainstorm, and it's just a place where people contribute essays relating to issues around mass incarcerations. And one of the essays we published recently was from a man named Ronaldo Hudson, who's now an advocate in Illinois, and he had spent 37 years incarcerated there. And he had many powerful insights, but one line of his really stuck with me, which is that the people he now sees as the problem are those who are choosing not to turn spaces, including prisons, into universities. And I just thought, I mean, for me, that's just like really stuck. It's like a brilliant sort of insight into what we could be doing. Like, why are we not enhancing educational opportunities and access to education? And so I think that, again, is another area where there's a real combination of outside legislative intervention and also internal policy.
I love that. I just want to acknowledge, for those of you who are in the room with us, we see you in the chat. We appreciate you being here, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat. The team at Vera is collecting those questions, and I'm going to turn to those in just a minute to make sure that we're getting you guys in the conversation. Jan, I want to turn to you. When you guys were going through your transformation in Norway, I can't imagine, but you correct me if I'm wrong, that it was just on the facility, it was just on the correctional institution. What were the broader policy changes and supports that were coming from the community that made it possible? And how do you think that's illustrative for what we need to do here in the US?
I had almost the same question in South Carolina. I think it was 2019 or something like that, where I was asked the question, what kind of legislative changes did you have to do to turn your prisons into a more humane direction? And I said that really we did none. There was none in our legislation that told us to treat people inhumanely in the starting point. So starting to treat people humanely wasn't any kind of, there wasn't necessary with any legislative work. But from the correctional department, they started to focus differently. So of course, it's hard or even almost impossible, at least it would be in Norway, to make these kind of fundamental changes on the level of each facility. So of course there has to be kind of management commitment on the department level when it comes to policies.
Yes.
So absolutely, I support that. But I would like to mention or follow up on I think that Premal mentioned about the basic rights in prison, like health care, dental care, mental health care, education. Um, this is, of course, also a very big question, but we recognized some years ago in Norway where the correction service had most of those kind of healthcare services and so on and so forth administered by ourselves. And we found that that didn't give good enough quality. And based on our principle of normality, that you should have the same rights in prison as outside prison, all educational, all education subjects, and running of the school, the health department was kind of outsourced to the local community. So those who runs the vocational training or the high school in a community also runs it in prison. So we import all those services, which ensures that the inmates have the same service level as everybody else in society. So we went in that direction to ensure that the incarcerated people receive the services necessary and that they were entitled to. So that was a little bit about the basic rights.
I think that's so
Yes.
important too, I imagine, Jan, because when you're having people from the community come in, you also have this constant cross-pollination of people coming in and out, making the facility more a part of the community and not just an island unto itself.
Absolutely, that's a good point, really, and it's of course very much easier to transfer back to society. If you're in the middle of an education, you can just continue at the same vocational
Right.
center in the community, or you can meet the same psychologist at the county hospital that you met in prison. So of course it's a much more seamless transition in and out of the facilities and the community. Absolutely.
I have a question for you guys from one of the participants in the chat, if that's okay. It's Sophia Lorenzi, and she asked, what are the ways in Norway and now in Restoring Promises work in the US that you've been able to implement a relationship change between incarcerated people and correction staff? And how do we scale that dynamic to larger systems? So Jan, you were talking about this earlier, really about, somebody comes up to you, they say, I'm not having a good day. And instead of just, shrugging your shoulders and turning around, you actually stop and engage in that conversation and how that sort of acknowledges humanity. How do we start to think about facilitating that at scale, relationships between the staff working in facilities and the people that are being incarcerated there?
Well, I think what we can do, coming from Norway or Germany or whatever, we can pitch some ideas, we can share some experiences, but I think the US has to own their own solutions. You have to, take some ideas and kind of adjust them to your culture and your context. So you can't just kind of import the way we do things without kind of well adopt it to your context. Um, I can give you one good example when it comes to scale. By the way, I think that's when you see good examples in the U.S., I think that's much more powerful to export those between states or between facilities than listening to a correctional dude from Norway telling you how to do things. I mean that's not the best way to do it. I think you should kind of look to the great experience that you now have in so many states. But let me give you one kind of practical example, not on the scale issue, but how to start down the correct path. Um, how about starting with a role play? Put correctional staff in the role of being inmates. Expose them in a correctional setting to the daily routines, the operations, the orders, the communication, uh, that is in a normal prison environment. That has been done in several states that I know of, and it's been so powerful because experiences from the kind of other side of the fence, the officers understand that this is not a sustainable environment. And when you have that experience, you kind of understand the problem and you start looking for better solutions themselves. I think that's a good way of starting. Um, but regarding scale, I mean, look to North Dakota, look to Connecticut, look to so many states. There are so many good examples out there already.
I love that advice. Yeah, and I feel like if we were doing sort of a practicum on walking in other people's shoes, we can fix more than just our problems related to our correctional system in this country. So that is sound counsel for us on a myriad of issues. Premal, any thoughts on how we need to start thinking about connecting the individuals, frankly, both staff and individuals living, both of which spend a lot of their life inside those walls, to have more human connectivity?
Yeah, um, Jan has much more insight, direct contact with people who are working inside prisons. But the one thing I would say is that I think we don't talk in this country remotely enough about the harm that the work does for people who serve as officers inside prisons and jails, and how often difficult and sometimes dehumanizing it is for them as well, to play certain roles. And um, I think that that's a conversation that we need to have much more frequently and out in the open about, what that job does to people, and what their reflections are, right? Like, I don't, I would, that's just not generally part of what I see as a broader conversation on, our massive system of incarceration, and how we're going to move to end it. And I think it's a really important piece of it. I mean, when we're talking about humanity, like, this applies to everybody.
Yeah, you would hope. I have another question from Marquise Butler. Marquise is a mentee in the Restoring Promise Cadre of Hope Unit in South Carolina. Shout out, Marquise. I hope you're doing well. What's the next step after achieving reform? How can we spread it throughout the prison? I think what Marquise is asking, beyond special units that are happening in facilities, how do you make it a broader movement throughout the prison, the community, and society? Premal, I'll start with you.
How to make this conversation a broader one among everybody? Yeah, great question. One of the things I've been sort of harping on, that I'll sort of come back to again, is that I think that one of the main areas for change that I see is increasing ways for people who are incarcerated to engage with the outside world, right?
Yeah.
To engage and to access information, to share information, to be able to advocate for themselves, to connect with their families, right? And so, because I think that that's actually a central piece of moving forward, and making change for people, I think that that in itself actually opens up space for increased conversation, increased daylight onto what's happening inside of prisons and jails for people who might not know, increased connection with family and friends, which will, teach us all better about what people's experiences are on the inside. I think those are the conversations that need to be happening to make this a more widespread conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and gets to the point earlier. One of the things about our correctional system in particular is that it's a place where there is a startling lack of transparency. We've had this, as you noted, conversation about policing as of late, but there are all these other points in the system that people have no visibility in and no idea. And until we start to challenge both our comfort level with the fact that there are these whole sets of systems that are completely beyond the public view, I think we're going to have something to grapple with. Jan, we have a question from Sue Burrell from the Pacific Juvenile Defender Center, and she's asking, what kind of physical setting should people be held in if we want it to be considered humane? What characteristics are needed to sort of physically have a plant that is facilitating supportive care? And I know you guys have thought a lot about that in Norway. Will you talk about what the physical plan of a facility that was really trying to be humane should look like?
Well, I can of course talk a little bit about that, but I would like to stress that even though architecture is important, it's not
Yeah.
the most important. It's how we treat each other as human beings. So let's remember that. We build prisons today kind of like a campus. Uh, we use what we call the Normality Principle, which means that life inside prison should resemble life in the outside world as much as possible. That's why we have, for instance, if you start with Halden, we have divided buildings, so we have copied everyday movement like you and I have. Getting up in the morning, taking a shower and having breakfast as I usually illustrate this by, and travel to work. And if I need to go to the dentist, I leave work, travel to the dentist. So all this movement we have copied inside prison. Premal mentioned earlier light. We don't think about how important
Yeah.
natural daylight is, but ask an inmate who's deprived of it, and he will tell you how that feels. Um, so, so, so that's what we try to make our kind of facilities more humane. We try to make them as normal as possible. Now, having said that, a maximum security prison can never be normal. We have to be humble about that, even in Norway. So when you stay a long time in a maximum security prison, many inmates kind of lose the ability to function inside society, or sorry, outside in society. So that's why, with that knowledge, that's why we have to have a kind of a gradually mm, transfer incarcerated people back to society. You should never, for instance, be released directly from a maximum security prison. That's really not a success story. So we try to kind of build our prisons as humane as possible, but we have to acknowledge that this is not a normal environment, and it's damaging to people really. So that's why we focus also on the progression model in Norway.
I want to ask you both. We have a collection of individuals assembled here, people who are running prisons, people who are staff working in prisons, people who are serving time in prisons, advocates and stakeholders who are outside doing work on this issue. If you had to put one thing to them walking out of this conversation that they need to be focused on, sort of carrying this work forward, what would that be? What's the challenge or thought that you think individuals in this conversation really need to lead with?
Should I start?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I will answer that in just a few seconds, Candice, but could I please respond to the gentleman from the mentee from South Carolina? Uh,
Absolutely.
Thank you. Because I would really like to kind of support what you answered, that we have to educate the public. We have to show the public what a prison is, what harm it does, and what good it can do if we do it the right way. So you talked about transparency, and to the gentleman in South Carolina, I think that should be the next step in the US. Be much more transparent about what is a prison. Do that to educate the public, and the more understanding you get among the public, the the more easier it is to make reforms inside. So that would be my general advice. Um, Now, back to your question, Candice, which was, if I remember, what people could, or could you rephrase it, was about what they could kind of take away from this discussion in a way?
Yeah, I mean, what's your charge if you wanted to leave people with one thought as they go
Yeah,
back into their lives and work? It's easy to pop into these conversations and pop back
yeah,
out. But what's
yeah,
the thing that you want to stay with people to resonate as they sort of move back into their daily lives?
right. Well, then I will have two answers. First, I would like to, address my colleagues, people that work within the corrections. I think I think people should ask themselves, are you compassionate enough? Because you have to be working in prison. Uh, are you able to see the person in prison, not only his actions? I mean, there are some fundamental questions you should ask yourself. Are really, the field of corrections the right profession for you? Because there are some, you have to look at your fellow man in a special way, in order to kind of be well, do the right things, in lack of better words. So that goes to my colleagues, and I must just say that I have met a lot of good and great colleagues in the United States. Professionally, I would like people to remember, um, basically, treating people like people in prison. It works. It
Yeah.
works. Whatever culture, whatever nationalities, color, beliefs. There are so many good examples around the world now. So whatever your personal opinion is, go to the facts. This approach works.
I love that. Premal, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I wanted to sort of frame it by saying that there's like a the sort of there's a bigger question around like how people get to prison, right? Like what we criminalize, how we sentence, how we punish, all of those questions. And those are not the focus of this conversation, but I think it's important to know that that's sort of a conversation that has, a lane, and that's an important sort of external piece. And then before we zoom into who's in prison and how we treat them. And
Yeah.
so I just want to kind of name that, and so it's part of acknowledging that the people who are in prison, you know there's a lot of raging debate about why they might be there, or whether it's right that they're there, right? And I think that that's important just to acknowledge, because the people who are in prison are people who love and are loved, and they are brothers and fathers and children, and so it's important to know that, and to sort of shed any idea that like that they need to be treated a certain way. And so through punishment. And so I just wanted to kind of frame that way. The two, in terms of how we treat people who are incarcerated, the two main things that I would say are, like, for me, the biggest central takeaways are: one, reforms or changes that increase the access of people on the inside to the world outside, and vice versa, to books, libraries, magazines, to the news, to their families, to people they can work with and learn from and teach. That opening of daylight and engagement, I think, can't be understated as a goal. And then second, basic human needs. We're thinking food, medical care, healthcare, access to sunlight. And then, when I mentioned this earlier, but women, menstrual pads, sort of basic human needs, and making sure that we are actually just providing those feels like a baseline first step that we need to be focused on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So
One
that
would,
was my final question to the two of you. But one of the things I wanted to do, because it feels like it's right in the spirit of the conversation, was cede the final question for this conversation to Ahmad Neely, who's a mentee in the Restoring Promise Cadre of Hope Unit in South Carolina. South Carolina is showing up here for this conversation today. And I really think that because Ahmad's question felt like the right question to leave it on, because he's framing it for the global point, I want to put this to both of you as the final question, and I'll ask you to be brief in the interest of time. How do we begin to destigmatize the negative connotation of the word prison or prisoner, so that more of society can understand that we are still human beings who just made a mistake in life, as opposed to those who have made mistakes and just haven't been caught? Premal, I'll start with you.
I think great question, and I think it goes to your point earlier too, Candice, about language and the choices that we make in language, and also about the fact that we often tend to, once people enter the criminal legal system, we as a community identify them by the act that they allegedly committed that led to their placement in the system, right? As opposed to all the other things that define them as human beings. And so remembering that, I think, is critical. And then in choosing our language really carefully, which is a reflection of remembering that people are human beings that deserve to have full-fledged, complicated personas that are well beyond one act.
Jan?
Yeah, difficult questions really about the words that we use. I mean, as a non-native English speakers, it's difficult for me to have such a precise, understanding of the different phrases. So I don't think I can respond in any good way to these questions really. But I think it goes back to what I said earlier on. In order to destigmatize, you have to show the world that these people who are incarcerated basically are just like you and me, just made a stupid thing or two, to put it simply. But they're basically 95% or 99% just like you and me. But just they've made one or two, I don't know, mistakes, but it doesn't, change kind of who they are. So again, you have to look at the person and not his actions. And if I may, I know we are short on time, but
You
I
may,
just
Jan. Go right ahead.
thank you very much. I mean, Premal mentioned the bigger picture, and I won't spend much time on this. Uh, One other part of the bigger picture is also, of course, prevention rather than rehabilitation. I mean, what I often say is that the best correctional service is what you provide when
Yeah.
thinking about prevention. Better schools, better communities, better role models in your local community. I mean, it's so much more effort should be put in, in the prevention side of this kind of complex rather than trying to repair people afterwards, because that's more difficult and more expensive. So I would just like to market prevention as one thing that should be focused on.
Yeah, and I appreciate that marketing. We at Public Welfare Foundation believe very much in putting resources into communities to ensure that they have what they need in the first instance. So I love that. Listen, I want to thank both Premal, Dharia and Jan Strømnes for joining us for this conversation. You all have been wonderful. And I want to thank the Vera Institute of Justice for facilitating this conversation and championing dignity in this moment in history, as well as their partners and co-leads, the MILPA Collective, for all of the work that they're doing in correctional institutions across the country and in the larger work of criminal justice to ensure that human dignity for those people who are incarcerated right now is not an afterthought in the movement for change. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for the work that you're doing in your respective careers and lives. We appreciate you and we look to see you in this work and on the other side. Take care.
Thank you.